Hi Internet, this is going to be an unscripted and unedited explanation of how the animation system works in the EZPZ Interaction Toolkit. And I guess by extension, it's also a basic introduction to how the animation system works here in Unity. So I'm not sure how long this is going to take. Let's see how we go. So what I've got here is I've loaded up the 07 space triggers scene in the example scenes, and we have a few things set up over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and press play and just go through the scene and explain what's happening. And I'll explain what's an animation in this scene and what's not. So the first thing to notice is these spinning signs here. So these are not animations, like not in the sense that we want to talk about today. Although you can see that they are animated, they're actually being run by having a constant rotation script. So if we just clicked on one of these, we can see that there is a script here that's actually it's not even a script, it's a constant force component in Unity, and we can see that we have a force for torque on the y-axis, and that's the reason why it's spinning on the y-axis. In the same way, we also have this one, again a constant force of 1 on the y-axis. So that is not necessarily an animation in the sense that we're going to be talking about. Another example that's not really an animation is this. So we've seen this earlier. So although like something kind of did happen, that was just a pop-up, and all that was is I'm just going to press pause on this. So all that was is this trigger was setting the poster to activate. So you can see that the onTrigger event is pointing to this object, the poster select rig, and all it is just setting that to be active. So if we were just to continue, that's going to go away. The reason why it went away is because we have a poster selected deactivate event in here. So what we're really going to be concentrating on is this door. So if we just get over the top of this trigger area here, you can see that the door just swung open. It didn't pop in, it didn't pop out, and then the door also swings back when we get out of the trigger. And what's happening there is that we have a, well, in this trigger, it's actually going back to this door pivot object, and you can see that it's communicating with a component called the animator, and it's doing this set trigger open. So if we have a look at the door, you can see that it has this animator here, and here's a window or tab that I opened earlier, and what this is it shows you the animation state machine that's controlling this door. So the way to get to this, I'm just going to close this so you know how to get to it. The way to get to this is you go Window, Animation, and Animator. So you might have a question. It's like, what's up? What's this other one? This animation here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what's happening here is these animations have been set up initially, and if we go through this, I'm just gonna quit pause there, go back to the animator. If we go to the parameters tab, you can see we have these two triggers here, open and close. And what we're doing by entering and exiting this yellow trigger over here is we're actually activating this thing. So when we go inside that yellow trigger, that open trigger gets activated. And the trigger is essentially just, well, in this context, the trigger will just be when you click on the circle, or when you set the trigger, it'll immediately do whatever it's supposed to do, and then reset to its original state. And what that did, if you'll notice, was initially we were in this closed initial state. It was looping this, and in this state you can see that it's just basically a null animation. It has nothing. All it is just a placeholder to do nothing, basically. But if you click on this animation here, there's actually an animation called door open, and I'll explain how we created that a little bit earlier. We'll make our own little example from scratch. But what this did was when we clicked on the open trigger, that actually met the transition condition of saying, okay, if the open trigger is activated, we'll transition to the door open animation. And that's what caused the door animation to open. Now, if we want to close it, you can see that there is also another transition here that says if the close trigger is activated, we move to this other animation. And this animation here is essentially the door open animation again, but in reverse. So you can see that this parameter here is the negative speed. And essentially, if you have a negative speed in an animation, it'll just run in reverse. And that's essentially what closing a door is, right? So if you go close like this, it's going to close. And then we have another transition, which is essentially just like, okay, once you close the door, you automatically go back to its initial state, which was the closed door. And then we're back to our original situation. So there's a few concepts behind this. So like this whole thing is called the finite state machine. So this comes from discrete mathematics, but you don't really have to go through a discrete mathematics course to understand what's going on. Essentially, just each of these boxes is what we call a state, and we can either have an animation or no animation in the state, and then we basically just transition between the states when we want to activate certain animations. And this is a very, very simple example. So just to summarize, initial, we go here, and then we have some transitions. In this case, we just do a trigger transition to open. And then once it meets that transition condition, we go to the next state, and each state has transition conditions. And then we've just set it up so it makes sense in this context, which is closing. Oh no, what have I done? So it looks like I've broken it because I haven't set the transitions and the states and things like that properly. So the way to fix that is to just like start again, restart, stop the simulation, and then start again. And then we have these error messages that we just ignore because they didn't actually come up during runtime. Okay, so now this is like a pre-baked thing. What do we do when we want to make something from scratch ourselves? So I guess the first thing is to make some animations. So what example can I give? Let's say let's make a drawbridge example, like just a drawbridge that doesn't do anything, because it's going to be on the same ground. So what I'm going to do is let's duplicate our door pivot. And then let's get rid of this animator here, because we want to start from scratch. Like we already know how that works, but we want to know how things work generally. So this door pivot, essentially what it is I've just set the door offset a little bit to the right, which means that if we click on the door pivot here and then use the pivot rotation, it'll rotate along the center of that object, which just happens to have the door in the middle. So I'm just going to reset this to be 0. So if we actually set the child object, which is the door, to be like right in the middle of the pivot, you can see that instead of it pivoting on the side, on the hinge location, you can see it now pivots on the center. And this is just, we're going back to the basics of parent-child dynamics for game objects and transforms. So we'll take advantage of this and turn this into something more like a drawbridge. So a door would have the hinge on the side, but a drawbridge would have the hinge, let's say, at the bottom. So I'm just going to move this is now a drawbridge. So I'm just going to change the pivot of that. Here we go. So now we haven't changed the parent object, but we've moved the child object up relative to the parent object. So now we have this effect when we do this. Okay, so we're going to take advantage of this and make a little animation out of it. So let's just set that to 0. So we're rotating it on the Z axis. So what we can do now is we can bring up the previously mentioned animation. And this animation tab, I like to put in this location because it's a bit long. This animation tab gives us what the animations do. And this is where we actually record animation. So if you look at let's inspect the door pivot again. You can see that we have a door open animation, and then we have these things called keyframes. And it's just a single animation. Let's just go over here. And all it is like initial state. The rotation on the y-axis is set to 0. And then in the final frame, you can see that the rotation on the y-axis is set to 103. So the only thing that we actually really set in this situation were these two things called keyframes. And then this is supposed to run, I think this is like half a second. So like the 30, like the 30 mark over here is like half a second. The here is the full second. But in between these two, Unity is essentially doing in-between frames. So this in-betweening, that's a real term in animation. It came from the practice that they have in Disney, where the chief animator would basically just animate like well, not even animate, just draw a few frames, and then you would have an army of lower ranking animators actually filling out the frames in between, so it's smooth. So otherwise it'll just be a pop open effect. So you'll just immediately see this, and then you'll just immediately see this. But that's why we need an in-betweening thing. But when we're recording the keyframes, we don't really need to do all that stuff ourselves. We just let the in-betweeners do it for us. In this case, it's the Unity animation system. So let's do this thing from scratch. Going back to our drawbridge, let's just rename this to be drawbridge. Drawbridge. And let's just a drawbridge pivot. And then we can go ahead and create an animation. So you can see this this object doesn't have any animations, but like if we click on something that does have an animation, we automatically see what that animation is. So if we go ahead and say create animation, I guess we get to I'm just gonna look for the animations folder. So where is it? Sorry, I like keeping my things neat. So if I were to look for where I put the animation on this one, door pivot, workshop assets in animations. Okay, here we go. So let's go ahead and put that in workshop assets. Actually, I should probably move that somewhere more logical, like inside the EZPZ toolkit. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's say animations there. And then if we were to go back to animation here, we'll just go ahead and say create an animation. Let's put it inside the animations folder in EZPZ Toolkit, and let's call this one drawbridge. Right, so we're done. well, no, we're not done. We need to go ahead and create the actual animation. And the way to do that is to create keyframes, like I was talking about keyframes before. So the way this system records keyframes is we have this record button over here. It looks like a recording button like you would have on film. And we just go record that. And now you can see that this area has become red, and you can see that everything that you can modify has also become red, I guess, except the transform, but you can't modify the transform. So what we'll do is we'll just slightly modify, actually we'll go to the 1 second mark, and then you can see that as soon as we modify this, you'll notice that a keyframe dope thing, this here is what you call a dope sheet. So a keyframe dope dot or some parameter dot thingies will show up as soon as we modify it. And what that is just recording that particular value. So you can see that I'm just going to set this to 90. So that was just for illustration purposes. So you can see that this came up. Then also this came up automatically because we needed a source. Because like what we did was we went straight to the 1 second point, and Unity just figured out that, okay, cool, your initial state must have been just like whatever the initial state was, which was everything being 0. I mean, all the rotation values being 0. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So if we go ahead and press play this animation, we can see a preview of it. And that's just our door continuously, our drawbridge continuously drawing down. If you think that's a little bit fast for a drawbridge, what we can do is we can move the final close frame a little bit further away from the initial sorry, I shouldn't say close frame because we're opening the drawbridge. Anyway, the final frame a little bit further away from the open frame. So the effect of that is basically because it's drawn out across a longer period of time, it slows down the opening of the bridge. Okay, so how can we make this drawbridge? How can we animate this drawbridge in the context of the game? Because what's going to happen now, if we go press play, is that this drawbridge will just continuously animate because it's not being controlled. And sometimes that's what you want. But I guess in this case, because this is an example of how to open doors and trigger animations and control them, let's go ahead and control them. So the first thing to do with this is we need to stop the animation from looping, because looping animation is not what we want for the drawbridge. So all that is we need to go find that animation and then I just happen to know that it's the drawbridge open animation because I put it there. But if you were like editing someone else's work and you didn't know the location, what you would do is you would just find the controller, and then once you find the controller, you will see that it's automatically created a state machine for you, and it's gone straight to the drawbridge open animation, and then click on that animation. So there it is, you got the drawbridge open. Anyway, so we have the drawbridge. We've just disabled the loop. Oh no, we haven't. If we click on this loop time here in the drawbridge open, that basically stops it from looping because it doesn't have a loop time anymore. And then now it only just animates once. But what if we didn't want it to animate automatically, right? So what we can do is then we can go back to its state machine and then tell the state machine, say, oh, actually, we don't want you to go straight to the drawbridge open animation. Let's create an empty state. And then let's rename that to something that makes sense to us. So just like initial closed, and then make this the default. So now, although we'll take care of the transition from the initial close to the drawbridge open close, but this thing actually keeps it from running by itself. Okay. But yeah, essentially what we can do now is we just replicate what we did with the door pivot, because it's the same logic. So we can make a transition. So this is now the door pivot animation, the state machine for the door pivot. Let's go back to drawbridge, and then what we can do is we can just make the transition from the initial close to here. And if we didn't do anything, what would happen is it'll just automatically go to this state and then flow right down to the drawbridge open animation. And I'll just demonstrate that. So we need to put a condition on this animation. And currently, the way to do that is to click on this plus condition here. But you can see we have this message, parameters does not exist in this animation controller. So we'll just expand that message there. So, but I'll just keep it like that because that's how that's the width that I like it. But that's the message here. Parameter does not exist in animation controller. So we need to add some parameters, and then we just go click on the parameters tab, which we already were in, and then let's add a trigger. In the parameters, we have a bunch of parameters, but today we'll just talk about triggers because they're pretty simple to deal with. These other ones, you can set them in code, but let's not deal with them today. So let's just deal with triggers. So just open the trigger, and then one simple trigger would be open, right? And it's looking very similar. But anyway, if we look at here, now we have a drop down that can select parameters. Now we actually have a parameter, which is the trigger open. And then all this basically means is that if the trigger parameter is set, make the transition if we are in this state, which we will be because that's the default starting state that we have. So just go ahead and press play, and then we'll need to keep tabbing back to the animator because that's how it's that's how this is configured. It goes back to the game view. Okay, so if we go blip, we can see that it makes the transition because once we click the trigger state, it'll meet the transition condition and then it'll move. So you see that didn't actually have an immediate effect. So what we can do is we can get rid of the has exit time, and the exit time is basically just like a form of animation blending. So it's not so it smooths animation blending between two states, but since this animation is empty, we don't really need to do any kind of smoothing. So just go ahead and press open, and the transition immediately happens. Okay, and then now we need a way to get back because we want to be able to open and close this gate, right? This bridge. So what we can do is we can duplicate this. So copy, copy, and then paste, and then you can see that it's pretty much the same animation, but we don't really want it to be the same animation. We want it to be close one. And as I explained earlier about the door, if we want to close the animation, and we can just run it in reverse. It's like not a big deal. We don't have to make another animation, although we could, but that's not very efficient. Unless you had like a very special, very specific way you wanted to close the bridge. But in this case, we just want to like run the animation backwards. So what else do we need? So now we need a transition here again. If this is just a plain transition without any conditions, I'll just show you what happens. Click. Did you see that? So we don't want that. We want there to be a guard, because as soon as because basically what this says is, as soon as this finishes the first run for the animation, then because we have no conditions, the immediate transition is to do the draw bridge close animation. So you might want that again in certain situations, but in our case we don't. So we want to have another transition. So one thing we could do is we could reuse the open trigger again, because as soon as we click the open trigger, it'll actually just like it's going to end up being a reset, and then just like dit. So as soon as it as soon as the transition finishes across here, the trigger is going to finish, so that so we can actually use it again. So if we just this trigger, and again the delay is caused by the exit time. So what we can do is we can just get rid of the exit time, and then we can just do the same thing again. You go beep, and then beep. So now that the issue with this is we're stuck in the draw bridge close animation. So we need to have another transition from the draw bridge close to be able to do the open thing again. Because if we don't, it'll only open and close once, and then there's no way for us to move from this state to the initial state for us to come back. I guess there's a few ways you can do this. You can instead of doing an animation from here to there, you can also have a state transition from here to there, but then it becomes a bit chaotic. So let's just do it this way. And I guess we're pretty much done here. So if we just go make this trigger happen again, and then it's open, and then if we exit, we make that, and then we can do the whole sequence again forever and ever and ever. Now the issue with this is if we just keep using this open trigger all the time, there's a good chance that the state and the game is going to get really confused. But let's just get this working. And essentially the solution to the problem that I'm alluding to is that we have this thing. We have basically two separate triggers for the two separate transitions of opening and closing, and that way there's no way for us to get confused. But let's get this drawbridge be activated by our player at runtime. So I'm just gonna get the drawbridge to, just gonna rotate this drawbridge this way, so it's somewhat logical. There's a somewhat logical sequence between the door and the drawbridge itself. I'm gonna move that down so we can actually walk over it. And it's kind of funny because the drawbridge is not moving. It's not trying to bridge any gaps, but like this is just for demonstration purposes. So let's forgive ourselves. We can use the prefabs here. We just use interactables, and let's make an EZPZ trigger here. And just to keep things neat, let's put the EZPZ trigger in the trigger area, and then just call this draw bridge. So now what we can do is we can just go ahead and on trigger enter, we talked to the drawbridge. Oh, we did something bad by not putting the drawbridge inside the environment area. So that's a little bit more organized now. And this text, is this part of the environment? Is this part of the triggers? Let's just say it's part of the environment. Because it's just displaying stuff. And then, okay, drawbridge here. Just go ahead and say drawbridge pivot. And now this is pointing to the drawbridge pivot object, which will have an animator, and then the animator component will have a set trigger. So the set trigger function that we want to use to the set trigger string, because we'll want to be referring to this one by text. The function set trigger int, that's just using the triggers by index, but like let's not deal with that because that can get confusing if we're just using indices. Okay, so let's test this. So basically what it is now is just like once we enter this trigger over here, that's going to make the animation run, and the drawbridge is going to open. Let's move the drawbridge a little bit down. Okay, I'm going to press play. So we're going to go through the door will open. And then when we get to here, the drawbridge will crush us. Okay, so this is another sort of interesting lesson in animation values. So so what the animation system is doing is actually it's literally setting, so whatever we have recorded here, it's setting that onto this animated object. The reason why I wanted to rotate this is because I wanted the drawbridge to rotate that way, not on top of us. So there are two ways we can do this. We can either change we can either change the actual rotation value of this to be -90. So if you just go ahead and press record again, and then instead of that being +90, we end up being -90, and then we can see that the animation now goes this way. The other way of doing it is a little bit hacky. Well, not any more hacky than this, in my opinion. Let's just make this 90. Is that if we were to create another parent of this drawbridge object, you just call this, we'll just get call that the drawbridge rig, and then we'll put the drawbridge pivot object inside of it. So I guess the point of this is these values that's being recorded in the keyframes is actually they're local values. So if we were to put now that we put this drawbridge inside a parent object, we can actually just do whatever we want with the parent object, and then the animation underneath will just run relative to the parents, relative to the local space. So what I'll do is I'll just center the bridge relative to the drawbridge object. We'll move it across here. And let's just go ahead and test it. If you run this animation again just by itself, that's going to open the drawbridge that way. But if we were to rotate the drawbridge, the parent object of the drawbridge, which is now the drawbridge rig, you can see that it still animates in the correct orientation. So this method is more preferable because it gives you a lot more flexibility. You can just go ahead and rotate it this way, and then the animation will still work because the animation is running at this level. It's still rotating at 90, at 90 degrees, at this local space. So then you can get away with it. So let's just go ahead and rotate this one 180 that way. Okay, let's test our bridge. So now if we just do it for real instead of hacking it using the scene editor, this one will just open in the correct way now. Cool. Yeah, so that's I guess that's pretty much it for this. The next step, if you wanted it to close, is you need to set your draw bridge to do something on trigger exit. And the most immediate thing we can do is basically just run the same command. Just set trigger string. But as I explained earlier, that could get a little bit confusing. So we can see that this will work. So we get into the drawbridge trigger like this, it opens, and then when we leave, it closes. But you might get into a situation where if you run the, it just gets. I don't recommend it at beginner level. So if we were to just do this, we have another trigger called close, and then we change this transition condition to be close, and then we change this command to also call close. We have the same effect, but it's a little bit neater than before. So it's near. Okay, so that's an unedited, unscripted tutorial of how to the very basic use of the animation system in Unity within the EZPZ Interaction Toolkit. Okay, that's it. Good luck.